Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Rawson with Art Builds Community. Thank you for joining us today for the first virtual noontime artist talk series sponsored by the Santa Clara County Office of Women's Policy. This will take place on the second Saturday of the month. Artists Honoring Women is a program under Womanhood, a Santa Clara County-wide art-centered project that will recognize the historic contributions of Santa Clara County women across all intersectional identities to the region and beyond. To find out more about the Womanhood Project, please visit the project's website, www.womenhoodproject.org, and sign up for emails to keep informed on what's coming next. I would like to introduce artist Susan Schwartzenberg and landscape architect environmental sculptor Cheryl Barton, who will be speaking about Richmond, California's Rosie the Riveter Memorial. Susan Schwartzenberg is a visual artist, educator, photographer, and curator whose work engages the public dialogue through themes of memory, history, and the psychology of place. She is a senior staff at the Exploratorium, where she currently directs the Fisher Bay Observatory, a windowed room of exhibits, instruments, and artworks designed to encourage an awareness of the built and natural landscape on the urban edge of the San Francisco Bay. Susan has exhibited her work internationally and has public works in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and Palo Alto, California. She has taught at the San Francisco Art Institute, California College of the Arts, and Stanford University. She is Loeb Fellow for the Advanced Environmental Studies, GSD, Harvard University. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, of course. Next, landscape architect Cheryl Barton is the founder and creative director of the award-winning OCB studio in San Francisco, known internationally as a leader in the shift toward climate literacy and resilient futures through green infrastructure and placemaking. Cheryl believes that design is grounded in the natural and cultural context of a site. The purpose of landscape intervention is not to overwhelm or subvert a place, but to build on its origins, reframing it in the ways that enhance it for the future, aesthetically, socially, and ecologically. Cheryl holds a BA in Fine Arts and Geology and a master's degree in landscape architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. LEED accredited, she has taught sustainable resilient site workshops in studios at the Pacific Energy Center, UC Berkeley, University of British Columbia, and California College of the Arts. For the past 15 years, she has served on the California Bay Conservation Development Commission's Design Review Board. Welcome, Cheryl.
Great to be here.
Thank you, ladies, for being here and joining us. So before we start the program, I want to remind our viewers to submit your questions or comments in the comment box. Or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please place your comments or questions in the comment section, and we'll share them with Susan and Cheryl at the end of their presentation. So join me in welcoming both Susan and Cheryl and their presentation on the Rosie the Riveter Memorial Project in Richmond, California.
Yeah, thank you so much. Could we have the first slide set up? Great. I'm going to start with a few comments, and then Cheryl and I are going to go back and forth, conversation-like. The Rosie the Riveter Memorial is a project of the city of Richmond, a working-class community across the bay from San Francisco. Richmond has a long industrial history and is the home of the Chevron's Richmond refinery. This project came together in 1998. I was invited by the redevelopment agency in Richmond to submit a proposal for the Rosie the Riveter Memorial. It was managed by a friend of mine named Donna Graves. I just met Donna, but we were closely becoming friends, interested in social and cultural history of place. I got a few bits of information from the Richmond History Museum. I was fascinated with this project, the scale of it, the story that Richmond was a community of 20,000 people before the war, and by the time the war ended, there were 100,000 people that came from all over the country to work in the shipyards. And for a long time, they had wanted to tell the story of women workers. There were no other memorials or stories in the United States or elsewhere really that honored women's labor. So I began to really look into this, but when I went to the site and I saw the scale of it, it was a big park on the edge of a waterfront. I was a photographer. I'd been doing environmentally based photography, designing installations, but this was one of my first public art commissions, potential commissions. So I felt like I needed another element of expertise. I'd met Cheryl Barton before. We didn't know each other very well. I held my breath and called her up and asked if she would please work with me. And to my delight, she said yes. And we started out from the very beginning that this was a collaboration. It was an equal collaboration. And we would take credit, both of us, for the design and development of this extraordinary story. I'm going to turn this over to Cheryl now to talk about her analysis of the site and how we really used her analysis and many walks there to really start the design for this project. And then I'll come back with a few of the story elements. So Cheryl, next slide, please.
Thanks, Susan. This is our analysis. It really, during the entire process, it was hard to know who was thinking what, because I think we had a brain melt at the time, a good one. But one of the things that I always do in my work is I get a sense of not where I am, but where the project is, where the site is, and what the adjacencies are, and how the story begins here. If you can see this slide of Richmond, we don't have a pointer, do we? We don't have a pointer. There's one. Go north. Further north. Stop. Okay, beautiful. Thanks, whoever's doing that. Right about there, well, back close to the water, there's a little notch in the landscape, a notch in the bay. But we're in the North Bay, and this was a shipyard in the North Bay. There were shipyards all around the bay. What was specific about this shipyard? What was interesting about it? One of the things we did notice first off was standing on the site, or even from this aerial photograph, there's an interesting angle between that site and the Golden Gate Bridge. So hold that thought. It comes back to what our thinking was. On the slide on the right, you can see a better, more detailed photo of that, image of that basin. It's now a yacht club, so a marina. And but that was the site of something quite astounding. Next slide. This is an aerial of the current site, the site 20 years ago, basically. And a circle around what existed there. Again, zooming in on what is, where are we and what is going on where we are, sort of first stage in a site analysis. This was a park that was built in the 1980s by Royston's office. And it was very much about just open space, picnicking and play areas for children. But what interested us in it was this little notch in the lower right-hand corner of the marina and the slope of that notch toward the water. Again, hold that thought. It comes back to our design approach. Next slide. And this is how that site looked in 1942. We were astounded when we saw these photographs. This had been a marsh. You could see in the background of the slide on the right, there's still just farmland. And as the north edge of the bay was mostly tidal marsh, this was a marsh that sort of gave its life to become part of World War II and win the war and build ships. Next slide. And this is what we found extraordinary about it, the scale, as Susan mentioned, the scale, not only the place, but the scale of the operations that occurred there for the years of the war. The scale of building the ships. We all knew of Rosie the Riveter, or people our age knew of Rosie the Riveter from the Saturday Evening Post Norman Rockwell sketch of her. We thought she just riveted and just used her strong arm and her bandana as her iconic image. But what had happened in World War II is that the building of ships at the beginning of the war, the building of ships changed. Shipbuilding ship technology changed from riveting to welding. And they really weren't Rosie the Riveters, they were Rosie the Welders. And Rosie the Riveters actually were a disparaging term that was used in the shipyards to talk to them. But women needed the work, men were off at war, and women conveniently fit into the smaller double bottoms of the ships that were being constructed at the time. They were more agile and more able to be dropped into these little places to do welding. The ships were 441 feet long. Again, something that astounded us in terms of length and scale. Next. And this is the workforce. This is a mention from all over the United States. People came in on trains and just moved into Richmond. Henry Kaiser, I guess it was Henry Kaiser. Kaiser Steel was a nationally prominent contractor who had worked in steel all over the country. He brought his forces to the Bay Area generally. And you'll note the name Kaiser. As part of the shipyard, he built daycare centers and healthcare and provided healthcare for workers. And Kaiser Permanente is a result of that initial effort. Next, but how to translate this whole thing into an art form, into a commemorative piece was still a puzzle. And it was these images that Susan had acquired, or that we had acquired at the museum in Richmond, that just showed the technological change in shipbuilding. And it went from being an entire ship being built at one time, it became component parts. And so this was the beginning of ideas for us about, component parts, and they were welded together. And that became this notion of reconstructing memory and bringing pieces of memory from all different places in a brain or in a shipyard and welding them together. And we then understood that it was our charge really to be welding the memory of this place and the women who work there. And so you can see just a couple of things, just the component parts of the ship, and then the ship ladders as they were built. The hull was built upside down. Again, these are pieces we began to pick up and use as our thought process. Next. These were the simple boards we submitted for the competition, showing some of these pieces now, where the ships were on the left, where the ships were, the angle toward the Golden Gate Bridge, because these ships were launched, went through the bay and out the Golden Gate to various parts of the world. And then on the right, our interest in the length of the ship, the scale at which these women worked, and that the site really needed not an object, but a distributed narrative, as Susan beautifully called it, through the site. And it would be composed of the pieces of a ship. So that meant that it would have all the elements. It would have a hull, it would have hatches, it would have a stack, it would have a fantail, and maybe it would even have a propeller. And it would be angled toward the Golden Gate Bridge. And as you saw from the photos of the basin, this also was a place in the park that had a slope toward the water. It allowed us to carry through that feeling of the shipway. Next. Early sketch. This is on the left. This is how it looks facing the water, and that there's a gathering place in the center. It actually, intentionally, we crossed the Bay Trail, which comes through this park in Richmond. And that was also a deliberate, it was deliberate for us to emphasize that. On the right, just a very simple paper model of how the 441-foot piece would look and how it would fit on the site in that surge basin. Next. Two sketches, one with a propeller and one without a propeller. We had to go before BCDC. We knew we would have to do that, and we thought the BCDC would consider the propeller as fill, which they did, but they were so enamored with the idea that they said we could have a propeller if we wanted to. So we thought that was a great success, and they actually applauded us when we proposed this in front of them. I was doing some work in Hawaii at the time for the Navy at Pearl Harbor, and I found 3 or 4 terrific propellers. It cost about $40,000 to ship them, and no one really had that in their budget. So we have an imaginary propeller out there. But we did have a fantail, and it was the fantail is the back deck of a ship, and we use that as an overlook. We really wanted something that moved into the water, got people out over the edge, and really engaging with the bay and the view. Next. Where are we, Susan? Is this this?
Yeah, these are just
These are images that we had to work with. Yeah, exactly. And these were drawings. These are hand drawings. These are not CAD drawings. These are not done with computer. These are hand drawings. And what we found is that many women were actually drafters. So there were women welding, but there were also women doing many, many other things throughout the shipyard here and elsewhere around the bay. And then at the bottom, the framed cross section of a ship was also a very powerful image that we used to really understand where the hull was, where the hatches were, where the stack was, and where the fantail was. So that it allowed us to develop, to scale essentially, a ghost of the ship of the ships that were built. Next. And then this is a CAD drawing because we had to build it. And on the right, you see our workplace, which was at the Richmond, at the Hunters Bay Point shipyards. We worked with a welder named Tony Dominski and spent many, many hours delightfully over at the shipyard working and watching the people weld it together. Next. And this is a balsa wood model that we made to then begin to start testing the scale of the hull piece that we could put on the site. And it's a diminutive scale from the actual ship, but it's just, again, this is just a suggestion of what went on there. And then you begin to see these ladders, and Susan has some wonderful photographs that began to populate these ladders and really bring out the story. Next.
Yeah, so, we wanted this to feel very authentic, and that's why we used real drawings that we made our sculptural components out of. The first idea is we might put imagery kind of on the structure, but instead looking again at all the photographs, the people were like little ants crawling all over these ships and using these ladders to go up and down. And so we use them as really to develop the narrative. And let's see the next slide. And here's the site. The project consists of several components. Certainly the sculptural components, you can see that upside down hull in the front. There are those two hatches where the greenery is. One is a rose garden and the other one is seagrasses farther at the end. The stack is really one of the stacks of the ship. The walkway, the 441-foot walkway, and just I think football fields are 360 feet or something. So you can see this is a very long walk. If you walk out to the water, there was a timeline made out of granite panels with text on them that sort of talked about the labor and social history that was going on during World War II. And when you walked back to the head of the memorial, you got quotes from women that we collected over the couple years we worked on the project. Can we see the next slide? And again, here's a closer view of the components. Again, it's a distributed narrative. I really loved how even in this outdoor area, we were able to create an environment where as you walk down the walkway, you're spinning around looking at the ladders, you're reading the texts on the ground, and people will turn. We thought they would walk all the way down to the end and read the historical timeline and then come back and read the quotes. But Cheryl is always so fond of saying that, they spin all the way down, reading one way, turning around, looking the other way. And it's just a lovely way in which people engage with the environment and the story. So next slide. And each ladder had a kind of a theme. So this is one of the first ones you would encounter. We thought of this one as the memory ladder. And again, it has the images showing the component parts. We had a workshop where about 50 women showed up with their families. We asked them to bring memorabilia or anything they had that helped them remember their years working at the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards. And they came in with photo albums, helmets, boots they wore, their identity badges. It was really extraordinary. We had no idea that these things things were treasure troves in people's homes. The image there that we used on the very top ladder is a photograph from some woman's car that she took a picture when she went to work. So I love how history is not just found in archives and museums. We all have shoe boxes under our beds and suitcases in our closets full of stuff that we don't know how to throw out. And in fact, quite often it's really important kind of personal and cultural history that we really mined in this project. The next slide, please. Another example, too, is this woman came to the workshop. She pulled out her identity card that she had had hidden away in her drawers for years. When she pulled it out, it fell into pieces. And again, this idea of reconstructing memory. At the time, my home base is the Exploratorium, and we were working on a exhibition on human memory. So we were meeting with neurologists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, learning about really a new neurological understandings about how the brain works and how we go about constructing memories. And in fact, that was a new term in the early 90s. This idea that memory is not a file in your brain. Every memory is constantly being worked on. And therefore, we're always constructing and reconstructing memory as part of our identity. And so we really loved picking up on this and using the component parts, the pieces, the stories, the fragments as really a metaphor throughout the entire memorial. The next slide. And during the process, the Richmond History Museum for almost 10 years had been trying to gather names of women who'd worked in the shipyards. I think everyone really had the Vietnam Memorial in their mind as a thing, some kind of object that would have the names of all the women who worked there. But unfortunately, Kaiser didn't keep those records. And the forms that Richmond History Museum sent out asked for names, when you worked there, what your foreman's name was, and then what you did. And interestingly, many people couldn't remember which year they were there. They couldn't remember the last names of many of the other people they worked with, but they had these phenomenal stories of what they did. And again, we mined those because it was amazing. They did more than welding. They did pipe fitting. They did painting. They did drawing and sketches. They did extraordinary amounts of work. And because, as Cheryl mentioned, women were smaller, they often had to go into these little tiny places to work. Apparently, it was quite claustrophobic, and we heard some funny and interesting stories about that experience. But in the memorial, as you see on the slide on the left, we created a little space to give people the sense of those that really difficult workspaces that many of these women had to experience during the job. The next slide, please.
They were wearing, I might interrupt, they were wearing 17 pounds of leather and carrying their welding torch in addition, and a pipe. They were on a pipe. They were on a line.
Yeah. So, and here's an example of one of the stories that came in. This woman filled out a form, but then added this lovely kind of collage with her badge. And here she does tell a story of being hoisted up on a crane to weld a part of the stack up really high. She said she was scared to death, but she did it, and she was proud of it. And she actually showed up at the memorial. So it was really nice. The next slide. This ladder really we thought of it as the statistic ladder, and this is one of the interesting things that happens when you do historical work, is you start to learn all this other stuff that was going on. And one of our mandates for this project was to really describe the home front. It was not just supposed to be about the Richmond Kaiser Shipyards or women workers there, but across the nation, what was happening. And I think what's great about this is you see, and I won't read all these statistics, but most people were put to work. Most people made almost twice as much money during the war. There were something like 18 million women working where there'd only been 10 million before the war. And not only that, there are about 5 times as much income tax was paid. So it meant that, you know, in the 1950s, if any of you were alive then, that's why we had all the roads and the bridges and the schools and the parks and everything else. And it reminds me today, you know, of what Biden's doing and how great it is when, you know, workers can support really the wonderful fruits of our labor in things like infrastructure. So it was nice to kind of get those facts out there to show what it meant that all those people, not just women, African Americans, people with disabilities, even some children had simple jobs during the war. So it was an extraordinary time for putting people to work. Next slide. Another really interesting thing we learned is that there was really quite a few factory accidents and deaths during the war. And this interesting New York Times article claimed that more people were dying in factory accidents in the early 1944 than had died in the war in Europe. Men were American troops in the war in Europe. And you know, statistics are really weird. I consulted historians. I finally found a labor manual that did kind of verify that there were about 1,000 deaths a month in the country during the war. And so a really important aspect of this was what prompted Kaiser to start his health plan. They had movable clinics in the factories to take care of folks. A lot of the women working were getting pregnant at times. So his next major impact on the world was healthcare. So, and also health and safety on the job became really important. And I love those shoes because I'd wear those today. The safety shoes were kind of stylish in
high-heeled safety shoes.
So next slide.
Gotta have them.
Mm-hmm. So the timeline and the sidewalk, we used granite panels. I think it was Sierra white granite, and on the way down to the water's edge were statistics about the war. Again, we concentrated on labor statistics. Another interesting thing to think about World War II is there was something called the Double Victory Campaign, and it was that title came from African Americans who, even before Pearl Harbor was attacked, and they saw the defense industry developing jobs, they threatened to bring 100,000 people on Washington to make sure that everybody got jobs, not just white people, but everybody got jobs. And the first anti-discrimination law was passed. And the Double Victory Campaign meant victory against our enemies in Europe and victory against our enemies within. So in other ways, change society so that all could work. Next slide. And on the way back, there are stories that we got from our workshops. Sometimes we took them from the forms that came in, and we also got to know different women and interviewed them. And the granite here looks a little funky, but it's early in the morning and the dew hasn't yet burned off. So you see this this kind of water in the paving. Next slide. So as you walk down the memorial, you know, you're in a park. It's really beautiful. If you go to the next slide, the stack also had image panels. And the next slide, we used a lot of those component part drawings and as blueprints. And these are all the panels, the image panels are made out of porcelain enamel. They don't fade. They're really beautifully done. It's kind of a clay surface that's hardened. And again, there are more quotes and statements by women. There's one statement even by a male worker here saying how proud he was to work with women and how hard they worked. Next slide. And then the next slide, we're walking down towards the fantail overlook. And next slide. At the end, we placed this quote you must tell your children, putting modesty aside, that without us, without women, there would have been no spring in 1945. And that was authored by actually a Russian worker, a machinist. Turns out that women were employed pretty much all over the world during the war, and in Russia too. And so this we found in an encyclopedia, and it really seemed to sum up the feeling that we got from women in terms of the pride of their role, and really something that I think, Cheryl and I learned about that generation and how important that work was to allow us to be professional women in our lives.
Exactly.
So next slide.
Just some background about how it was built. We're sort of deconstructing it at the moment. This is the fantail part of the ship. It's the piece that catapulted out over the water. And it needed a base. It needed a base that was a concrete footing that would be covered with water. And we had to organize the construction crew to be there at the end of July with a full moon and high tide, so that the outgoing tide would have the furthest distance from this construction site, because they had to cure the concrete, in within 30 minutes. And that's quite extraordinary. Especially, and the concrete is slurried in through a pipe. And about partway through this, about 10 minutes into the 30 minutes, we noticed that they were hammering the pipe with sledgehammers. And it turned out that this fast curing concrete was actually curing in the pipe. Anyway, it was resolved and moved forward, and just in the nick of time, the water covered the almost completely cured concrete. So it's very exciting operations as this was going on. It actually took us 3 months to build. And there are many women who worked in the shipyards who were following this. They had been to our workshops, and they would pop into the site just to see how we were doing. And they'd lean on the fence and they'd say, "Hey, we built these ships in 4 days. What's the matter with you guys? Why can't you build things faster than that?" So it was very interactive. I should say it was very interactive. Next slide. And this is the look at that. The fantail, the end of the keel walk, as we call it, and the low tide version of that basin that we took advantage of because it existed. Because we knew that this is a corner of the bay, of the whole bay, where king tides take place. They absorb king tides, and that this park design was good enough to create that so that the site would be resilient for high tides and climate change. Next slide, which is one of my favorites. So lo and behold, it works. Lo and behold, just before the higher ground, the tide stops. But this is a king tide from the 2010 or something, 2009 or 10, and we watch it. It's interesting to watch. And we think informative to the public. Next slide. And this is a little high tide, where the fantail just floats in the water. Next. Just this aerial and the wonderful crossing of the Bay Trail. Our intention, but it's so interesting to watch people walk by or cycle by and run over this. We intentionally put a paver in the middle of the cross path, and people will circle back and stop and just sort of discover this place. So it's very exciting to see that happen, and then people coming in to really try to figure out what happened here. Next. Again, the walking version of the Bay Trail crossing. Those two stone pines were actually there. They were sort of another sort of fortuitous gift of the site, the existing site. So they created our alignment to the Golden Gate. Next. Susan.
Yeah, so just a few words to sum up around our relationship to community. I mean, we certainly worked a lot with the city of Richmond, many of the different agencies there. We worked with the Rosies and all of the people that had really come together, historians and others, to tell this story. But we also, right before the memorial was about to be built, suddenly the community that lives around it got a little concerned and worried that this thing was going to be too big, it was going to block their view, it was going to attract people, and they were going to lose this playground that they had. So Cheryl and I went out there and we staked out the whole thing. We got a balloon. It didn't work, but we were going to try to show them how high it was. And we had the drawings, and we convinced them that the thing was pretty transparent, really. If you remember the upside down hull, a lot of the chunks of it were taken out so you could see right through it. And we were adding gardens. And later on, Cheryl, you did another master design for the park and put a new playground in, I believe.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So next slide. And I think one of the things around the community, and I was just thinking about the name of, Art Builds Community. I mean, that was really the point. It wasn't so much we were just working with the people we had to. The whole neighborhood around there and Richmond began to know this was happening. They were interested. We found that this work built a community around the whole project, so that while it was happening, another effort was underway to turn that whole area into a federal national park. And right before the memorial opened, Clinton signed into law that this was the Rosie the Riveter Homefront Park, which meant that it would be maintained forever. They were going to add a visitor center. And it had a great hullabaloo, if you see the next slide, for the opening of this thing. I mean, every Rosie, I think they spent an enormous amount on this fabulous opening. There were over 100 Rosies there. I think they all had boutonnieres, and they all got bags and name tags. There were senators there, and the mayor of Richmond, and they even let me and Cheryl say a few words.
Amazing.
World War II swing band playing, and they also had World War II airplanes zooming overhead. So it was a super beautiful, fun day. Next slide. And, it's sad, too, that a lot of these women have pretty much all passed away now. There's very few. There's one woman who's a park ranger who still goes out and tells stories and is nearly 90, I think. And Betty Saskin, some of you may have heard her on the news. She was not technically a Rosie, but she did work in offices and wound up being very involved in the park as a leader there. And then the next slide. And I think one of the really important legacies, and doing public art, and I'm sure Cheryl doing all the landscape projects she's done, is that you realize the legacy is not just that you made this thing and it's people will remember, but it becomes a part of public history. It becomes a place of inquiry for people. Sometimes, learning doesn't just happen on your own, it happens with people. And so I really love going back, and, nobody remembers us very much anymore, Cheryl and I, but the park takes care of it. Even the neighborhood takes care of it. They'll come out and sweep around it and do various things. And in that one image on the right, I was there one morning early, right after the park opened, the memorial opened, and, there are people wandering in and out. And on the right there's an extended family. And it was obvious that the grandmother, had some experience during World War II. So she was between panels, telling her son and her grandson. And when they got to this particular stone, the grandson asked her, what does internment mean? And on that stone, we had the date when the Japanese internment began. And so then they had a really wonderful family conversation about what that meant and what that was. So I think The legacy is much more than a designer and an artist, two artists coming up with something. It's really how the community responds to it and builds on it. And it's extraordinary what Richmond has done with this project in terms of having the story travel on way beyond our work. So with that, I don't know, Cheryl, this is our last slide. We'd love to get some questions, and Cheryl might want to add a thought at the end there. I don't know.
No thought. No thought added. Let's chat.
Wow, that was amazing. I learned so much. I can only imagine how much our audiences learn, and I know that our team, Art Builds Community, is viewing this presentation, and we are just amazed by the project, size of the project, and all of the work that it took to go into it, it sounds like. And I do have questions here. So some of them are more about maybe speaking a little bit more on some of the topics that you both shared. So I have one here. It says, how has the space changed since the memorial was built, and have more people gathered to hang out there? Have you two gone to you go and visit? You just said that now you go, not so many people remember you, so you get to see it in this different perspective now, years later. So curious about that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's well maintained, which is useful. I mean, that's always the fear of public work of any kind. It's like, how will it be maintained? And we're very fortunate to have the relationship with the National Park Service, and a budding little museum of history close by. So it invites people in, and it's always had people in it every time I go there. Sometimes it's little league soccer being played in the distance, but they like to kick the ball toward the memorial just, for fun. But it's interesting to see how inventive people can be in that space and how curious they can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it does get a lot of work, a lot of action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the city of Richmond continues to add stories. A whole another set of signage went up along the Bay Trail and in the city of Richmond. They have events at the Rosie the Riveter Visitor Center. There's even restrooms close by, which I just noticed last time I visited. I thought, wow, because so it's dearly lovely. They have festivals there. They have stuff that isn't even about Rosie the Riveter. I went there for a bunch of pony rides once, so it's, barbecues and Frisbee games and everything happens there. So it's really cool.
Yeah. So it was able to kind of still be a part of this community space the way it was prior to the work going up. And you had mentioned the community was a little worried that they were going to lose what they had, but really it's probably, if anything, enhanced that experience. As you said, I think it was you, Susan, I was writing down a lot of notes. So the legacy is the art. The art becomes a part of public history, right? And we experience it together. Yeah, and I think that's what it sounds like is happening now. Though people may not truly get it yet until they start reading the panels, I think as they continue to visit the space, it becomes part of what they're learning in their everyday life. I think that's fantastic. I have a couple of more questions here. So you shared what happened, and you showed some really incredible photos of the Rosies at the event once it was open, and mentioned all the different people, the politicians that were present, and others for the opening. But I'm curious to find out, what was this? Other comments, was there, what other, do you recall any more comments that were happening around that time that maybe were unexpected, or, just curious to hear, since you said this was one of the first memorials, so what was that national experience like?
I think, what I was, it's funny what you think the success stories are in a way. I mean, one obvious one is the New York Times did an article right after it opened, and they interviewed many of the Rosies. We had a one-liner in it that somebody actually designed the thing, but many stories about Rosie's. There was a really nice spread, I think, in the Chronicle that showed the drawings of it. And then I think this might sound funny, but on, what is that, Highway 80 there, or 580? There's a sign on 580 that says Rosie the Riveter Memorial, get off here. That is super success. Never expected that.
Because that becomes a Caltrans situation. That's different, right? So we know in the public art world with that all, there's a lot of work behind that kind of change on the highway. We have a question here from YouTube, it looks like. So what was the most awe-inspiring emotional moment or part of researching building this project? What hit home the hardest? And that's from Taylor DeBose.
What as we said, the scale of it, and that these weren't riveters, they were welders. I mean, just the monumentality of the work they did, and they did it well. And at this urgent moment in the history of this country, and that was awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and I think for me too, it was a little bit. It was, Cheryl in my generation, kind of grew up coming to our consciousness in the 60s, and so we were anti-war and civil rights, and kind of thought our parents were really conservative. And when I saw what they actually did, when we started researching this, I realized, yikes, what a silent generation for all the contributions they made. And I think to me, that was kind of a real eye-opener.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine, and actually this kind of fits into another question we had, more about the artifacts that came in. How you talked about the people bringing in those artifacts. Was there maybe a story that still sticks with you both today, that maybe you didn't get to share in the presentation, that you kind of just it just hits your head every once in a while? Or I can only imagine that so much came through. It sounded like a lot of people came through and shared what they could remember.
Susan, I think the one that, well, I don't know, I think we both resonated with the one which was a letter. And it was from someone who described all the work. And then she, at the end, said, could you just confirm that I really was there? Or something like that. It'd be great if someone could really confirm that I actually did this.
Yeah.
That there was this disconnect between where their life was now and what it was then. That was really powerful.
Yeah. There was also that funny moment when, when we had the workshop, it was really a kind of free-form discussion. We had no idea all these people would come, and they just burst into this amazing kind of laughter and talking. And at one point somebody said, and they were having sex down in the double bottoms.
Right.
He was laughing, and we thought, wow.
Yeah, all right.
Wow, they remembered that, huh? That's great.
Well, and the other thing that happened during the just the gathering, one of the gatherings we had, was that the men came forward. Oh. And they, one man in particular, talked about how the mariners, the marine sailors and so forth, were very skeptical about going out in boats built by women. There was a huge international fear of that.
Wow.
And but he described then a journey. I guess it was in the Merchant Marine. I guess he described a journey of one of the trips they made, and they were picking up coffee in Brazil, and then going to some and dumping it off somewhere, and then getting titanium or something from somewhere else, and then taking it over to this part of the world and that part of the world. It was sort of a global trip that he made, and he was so excited to be back. And on the way back, there was a typhoon or a hurricane or something that was the boat met with, and the boat did very well in that because of the double bottom. And but so he relayed his fear, but then his tremendous appreciation for everyone from the work that women did.
And it's great that he recognized it. right?
Yeah, yeah.
And was
It's very,
willing
very
to
brave to
share.
come forward.
Yes, yes, yeah. So, speaking on that, why do you, maybe each of you can share, because you might have different thoughts on this, but why is it important to create recognition art for women? As we embark of women, as Art Bill's community with the Office of Women's Policy embarked on our project of Womanhood for the Santa Clara County, why should we do this? What are your thoughts?
I mean, for me, I think it's, more and more you find out when you dig into things that women are behind a lot of stuff, they were behind the 9/11 report. They're behind Save the Bay. They're behind another project I did about Disability Education Act. They're silent often about what they've done, and it's only more recently that they're out front taking the credit for the work they've done. We have a woman vice president. That's phenomenal, and she's not afraid to say what she does and who she is. And that's taken a while for women to actually take their place. So that's why I think it's important.
Exactly.
Thank you. No, appreciate that. And from what you know about Santa Clara County, what hopes do you have for this Womanhood project in our county? As visitors, what would you be curious to learn of the 15 municipalities we have here in the Valley of Heart's Delight?
I'd love to see a list, or I'd love to see who you're thinking about. I think that's a big project. I can't imagine exactly. Is it going to be in one place? Is it going to be all over the place? It's kind of, and then also I think, the idea of, again, public stuff. You go out and you come in a park, sometimes you don't know what you're going to find, and suddenly you learn something. I mean, to me, that notion that this might be public somehow, and that there are silent voices that you're going to bring into the forefront somehow, how fun to walk around in San Mateo and learn about hidden stories.
Right.
Well, if you go back in time beyond the European invasion of California, I mean, there's a lot of that kind of history that reflects toward our attitude, should be incorporated in our attitude toward the environment now. The sort of understanding that, and I think women had a lot to do with those kinds of things. So bringing forward some of those ecological lessons from the past, social lessons from the past would be important.
No, thank you. Yes, absolutely. And those are all things we're definitely thinking about. So appreciate hearing you say that as well. We have another question here. So why is it important to both recognize individual women by name? And how did it change your perception of women's role in the war?
We wound up not, we have a lot of quotes by women. If they wrote a letter, we showed the letter with their name, and we got rid of the address, but it was an authentic document, so but some of the quotes on the ground we didn't attribute, and we named all of the women who contributed things on there's a panel that's kind of the introductory panel that's next to the memorial, so everyone who participated's name is there. But we thought, because we couldn't put 100 quotes, we could only put maybe 10 quotes, that we wanted them to feel a little bit more universal, like you could own that quote if you read it, and it wasn't owned by somebody else. So it was but I think naming, putting names on things, or I don't know, however you might want to do it, is also really valid and important. But but sometimes a quote kind of inspires you to, put your own story to it. You know what I mean? And so that's really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Cheryl, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, it depends on the scale of the piece too, to some extent, and the breadth of it. And so I think the situation changes basically if it's a small scale piece and it's very clear that it's about one person or two persons, people's idea, versus it being a celebration of a group of women. So I think it's a case by case scenario, but there are ways to be published, which is also important for women, that more women get visibility, so that there should be an idea behind who's going to publish this, who's photographing it, and where it's going, and what are we going to say about it, ready to roll when the project is open, so that women have that sophistication about, okay, here's how women get credit. You get published, or you get you are on television programs or documentaries or whatever. So there's a bigger piece, the sort of behind the scenes of a art piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've definitely seen public art that's been very specific to an individual, but we've also seen public art where it recognizes a group, right? Whether it's the Rosies, or it's maybe, for our case, women who work in the canneries, right? So how, really thinking about how do we tell their stories as individuals or as groups? What makes sense? And I think that really also comes from community engagement, and what we're hearing, as you both shared, you did so much you did a lot of community engagement, it sounds like, and received so much feedback. And then it's at that point of, which one do we choose, or do we decide to do it as a whole? And it seems like you were able to do a little bit of both.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there was always this hope, and, that maybe, I know with Donna Graves, our project manager, we thought maybe a book would come out of this. We could go into a little bit more, publish more of those forms that people sent in, because they were, I showed a few historians these documents, had hundreds of them, and they were just amazing. It was a wonderful, beyond the memorial, there was just a lot of knowledge about jobs people did, work they did, things they learned, a lot of stuff, those personal accounts. Again, they're a rich history. It's only been in recent decades that oral history is considered history, and that's, I think, really, really important.
Yeah, and I think that would be fantastic. I think you can still do that. I don't, just because it's been completed for some time, there's people who are always curious and interested about this history. Those who have lived here for decades, whose generations have been here. You showed that last photo with the grandmother, her son, and her grandson. I mean, that's 3 generations. So I can only imagine what 4th and 5th would appreciate as time continued. I have another question here, and it's more for the artists that are watching. So what advice would you give for artists aspiring to do this kind of public artwork?
It's incredibly rewarding.
Yeah,
it's a captured audience. And you have to prove yourself. You have to prove the idea to engage them. Whereas if you're doing your own piece for a particular gallery or museum, it's less so, I think. I mean, I'm sure there are artists who would disagree, but it's more controlled in that environment. In public, it's less controlled, sometimes more painful to get accomplished, but you feel engaged, and that you've helped move the needle in some direction about understanding the art, understanding the place. So,
yeah, and I think another really important advice is, don't think you know what you're going to do until you actually talk to everybody. Listen and be able to change your mind about what the story is. I think, And that's really important, that you don't go in thinking you know what it is before you hear the actual testimonies.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as we hear more stories in the news, when you are looking, I mean, we at Art Builds Community are always paying attention to what's happening with the public art, and community input is incredibly important. Doing that community engagement really early on, and to make sure that we're casting as wide as the net as possible to understand the wants and the needs and the themes, and that everyone has the ability to share. Whether or not we're able to move forward, or the artist is able to move forward with it, the opportunity is there, and I think that's important. People feel like they're being heard, and they have, and they should be, right? So, it sounds like that's what was happening with this project. Absolutely. Yeah, I have a couple more questions. We might end a little early, but I definitely wanted to get these asked. So let's see. How would you do things differently, and what would you keep the same?
I think, I mean, we didn't talk on I mean, we're supposed to design something would cost so much. We probably tripled the cost, but it should have cost more. It's not uncommon that things cost $1 million and this didn't, but it should have. So that we could have had more voices in there. We could have had a little bit more of the sculptural components. It's not a money question, but it's just, now I feel like I wish there was more there, more story, more of the things we found. But on the other hand, I really love that the federal park took over, and the Rosie the Riveter Center is now, Cheryl they just took some of the models. We're thinking of some other documents that they might like to take to kind of enrich the story from the museum perspective, which seems super great to me.
Did you have anything you want to add to that, Cheryl?
Well, just I'm thinking about the money thing. I mean, we couldn't do a single object design in that space, and with all that we knew, and the power of what we wanted to share with everyone. And so we knew going in, we knew we had a design that wasn't meeting the budget, and we were very clear about that in the interview at the very beginning. We said, here's the idea. This is our idea. We think this is what the place needs, but we can only afford the hull, and we're happy to help you. We did. We said we offered to say, okay, we can help you raise money. We can meet with people and just start a campaign to raise money for this. But after a major public meeting, where, to Susan and my, I guess, surprise and delight, many citizens got up, went to the podium, and said, we have to have this. Mayor, we need the money for this as it is. We don't want to take it in pieces. So we moved forward. And we didn't get the propeller because, it was in Honolulu and it was too expensive to fly in. But, as Susan said, there's still things we left out. But we did get enough to actually build the entire piece.
We also, there was a local contractor in Richmond
that's right.
Project pro bono, pretty much.
That's right.
And so that really, and they were, really good. They became the sort of on-site construction managers, and that was super great.
Yeah, great.
Get that kind of support from the city and residents of the city.
Yeah.
That's great. Right.
So the idea and the enthusiasm just kept rolling and just generated this the project that we could actually call finished.
Yeah. Right. Yes. It sounds like you had a really great amount of support all the way around. for this project, to get financial support from the community to push that. I mean, that's really, that can be a hurdle, difficult to jump over sometimes. So it sounds like that was some successful for this project.
We did a lot of explaining.
I wanted to ask, besides the Richmond History Museum, was there any other partners that were part of this? Of course, it's a city, it was with the city of Richmond, but was there anyone else or any other groups that you worked with?
Yeah, I mean, the research, it started with the Richmond History Museum, but we worked with the Bancroft Library, the National Archives, the Boston Naval Shipyard, a Radcliffe Archive, personal collections, Oakland Museum, and the San Francisco Public Library too.
Right.
And how long was that process? Do you remember? I mean, I'm sure people were still bringing, paperwork in and memories in, but that, that must have been what you just described, Susan, I'm assuming was at the beginning when you just kind of started, okay, what do we need to know? Did you continue to reach out to those partners throughout the rest of the project? Or at some point, did you kind of slow that down and start working with community members and asking them to bring in their memories?
It was kind of intermixed, really. Excuse me. You kind of don't know when to stop until the time ends,
Yes, I know that feeling.
There's a deadline because, there was a whole lot more stuff at the Oakland Museum that we never really got to. And as a matter of fact, Dorothea Lange's collection was there, and we used a little bit from it, but not as much as we probably should have. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, as somebody who has a degree in art history, I absolutely understand. I can't help myself when it comes to the research. So those libraries are magical places filled with so much information and history. I think for one of the last questions I wanted to ask is, I don't really see we're coming in, and I was able to ask what was already sent my way. So the memorial is, what was that? 441 feet.
441 feet.
That's
Give or
amazing.
take a few. I mean, we had a certain amount of the site to deal with too. We had pretty much the whole. That's part of the fantail going into the water was related to that. So 441 feet.
That's amazing. I encourage everybody to definitely go and check out this space. I've been there. I think it's incredible. I enjoy being able to visit and experience that part of the Bay Area. Susan and Cheryl, I wanted to give you the opportunity to provide, share anything else that maybe you can't get a chance to share now before we conclude the program.
Should we talk about the Fiden book just briefly? We had an interesting, 20 years later, an interesting call from Fiden Press, which is an art press that many of you know about. And they were doing, the author was doing a personal piece on memorials globally. I mean, the really big, important ones. And he also called us. And we said, what? This little tiny, yes, I want that one. So he's done a beautiful color photography book of memorials around the world, and there's little Rosie sitting in the midst of all the other ones and love or don't love. But it was interesting that it's going. It kept going. It came back.
Yeah. I mean, lately there's been, for some reason, Cheryl and I have been called a couple of times this last year to give talks or to things like that book or articles that are coming out, and it's I'm not sure why, but it's great. It's great, and these things. Like I said, I think a lot of times we maybe are under the caption. Our names are in the caption, and otherwise it's just writing about the story, which is also really, I think, wonderful that things kind of live on beyond you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reason why is because this was the first memorial to recognize these women, and you two women did it. So, and you both are incredibly humble because was an amazing project. And I am glad to hear that someone from Faden did reach out to you to include you into a book about memorials around the world. So congratulations on that. And now I'm going to have to connect with you after to get the title and author. Because I want to check it out now. So thank you both. Thank you, Cheryl Barton and Susan Schwartzenberg. I appreciate your time today. It's been a very incredible experience to learn more about this public art piece that I've engaged with personally. On a different level, I felt like I was in art history class again. So thank you for that. Thank you so much.
I think we're old.
No. I just always wanting to learn. So, so I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon to listen to this incredible presentation about the Rosie the Riveter Memorial in Richmond, California. I want to encourage all of you to join us on April 24th for Mapping Women's History. It's going to be a workshop. You can go to www.womanhoodproject.com to sign up for that program. We're going to continue to have artists talks every second Saturday of the month. So please keep an eye out on that. You can follow us on social media on our Instagram and Facebook accounts. And please sign up for our newsletter to keep up with what's coming next. So thank you again on behalf of our Art Builds community and the Office of Women's Policy for the Womanhood Project. Have a great rest of your day.